as I was saying to Dalla and Shana, hopefully, as you can tell from the title, I called it On Being an Outlier, Participatory and Arts-Based Health Research in the Service of Practice and Policy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I do that's specifically using arts-based methods. Just to tell you a little bit more about my background. So as Val, thank you for that very kind introduction. I am a qualitative methodologist based at the Applied Health Research Center, working with Mohammed Mamdani and that team at St. Mike's. And I also have my own program in narrative and visual methods research at the Shing Knowledge Institute at St. Mike's. I'm also assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy and at the Graduate Department of Rehabilitation Sciences, which is now renamed the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute at U of T. I'm also a fellow, an academic fellow at the Center for Critical Qualitative Inquiry at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health here at U of T as well. Before I became a physical therapist and practiced for 18 years in critical care and in surgical oncology, I actually had a degree in social and cultural anthropology. And my master's degree was epi-focused and was quantitative, and my PhD used storytelling and qualitative methods and anthropological methods, looking at patients with primary bone cancer. And then for my postdoc, I did a postdoc at the Center for Research on Inner City Health in the Health of Marginalized Populations, and that's where I started doing film-based research with my colleague Jim Lavery. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor that might explain why I'm sort of an odd person. I've actually done some work with health technology assessment, and the talk I'm going to give to you today, the stuff that we're going to talk about, some will be about health, some will be projects related to health services research specifically, and some will actually have a link to health technology assessment, public engagement, and community engagement with biotechnology and new technologies in Australia. So without further ado, let's launch in. So I like to give people a map of where we're going to kind of have an idea of sort of, is she almost done yet? You know, when you're sitting listening to somebody giving a talk, that you sort of have some idea where we are. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then we're going to talk a bit about arts-based health research, what that is, and arts-based knowledge translation, because those two actually go really hand in hand. We're going to talk about participatory approaches, just briefly touch on those. I want to give you some sort of idea of the underlying theory and methodology that is part of this type of work, and the lenses that I use to look at this kind of arts-based work in the service of health service and policy research. Narrative approaches have to do with storytelling, and I'm going to talk to you about narrative theory and narrative methods. And then I'm going to talk about visual methods and image, and why image and story go so well together, and why film is a great way for doing research. And then I'm going to give you some examples. So I've engaged in making full-length documentary film. I've pioneered a new research method called broker dialogue with my colleague Jim Lavery at St. Mike's, and I'm going to show you an example of that, actually both an animated description of the method and then an actual empirical example. And then if we've got time, we can talk about other things that I'm involved with, which include research that involves drawing as well as photography. I've done work with photo voice. And I have some graduate students as well who are using drawing as a visual method for their PhDs. And then if we've got time, I want to leave time for questions and discussion, but if we've got time, I'd like to talk a little bit about evaluation and impact and how we know whether these things, particularly from a knowledge translation perspective, are useful. So just an introduction, you know, outliers matter. Because they do actually influence what happens in the broader field, but I would characterize myself as kind of like way out there on the health services research continuum, but I have lots of friends and colleagues that I play with in here under the curve. So just to give you a little bit of a framework for arts-based approaches to health research. So it's actually a burgeoning approach within qualitative social science, and it actually has a longer tradition in the social sciences and humanities, and particularly in the area of education. but it's relatively new in the field of health research. The arts and humanities, when we bring them to bear on the research process, constitute a different way of knowing. And they not only engage us from a cognitive perspective and from a rational perspective, but they also have an effective or emotional component, and that they bring that into healthcare and health research. When we think of a definition of arts-based approaches to health research, it actually entails the use of the arts for generating, any use of the arts for generating or disseminating knowledge in healthcare. And so it can be at different points in the research process that we bring the arts to bear. And a range of genres can be used in the process of both knowledge production, i.e. primary research, or in terms of translation and dissemination of results. And so these genres include film, which I'm going to talk to you quite a bit today, photography, photo voice, multimedia presentations, so sound, photo and sound installations, drama, a research-based drama, poetry, research-based dance, and so forth. So this is just a snapshot of a paper that my colleague Catherine Boydell and I, a guest editorial that we wrote about arts-based research and knowledge translation and why these might matter to healthcare professionals. And so this is published in the Journal of Interprofessional Care, and it seems to have received a fair amount of uptake. And one of the things that I want you to, or I'd like to address with you is like, why should we as healthcare professionals, healthcare researchers, or health economists care about this? Because arts-based approaches are efficient at imparting complex ideas and research findings in accessible and meaningful formats without oversimplifying, and I think that's really critical. Arts-based methods of knowledge translation, for example, are complementary to traditional approaches. So we're not saying that they should replace traditional approaches, but they can work alongside traditional approaches, with the potential to enhance knowledge uptake among target audiences, whether these be practitioners, patients, policymakers, or members of the public. And as such, they produce findings and tools that are accessible and well suited to engaging all of these different stakeholders. So that notion of engagement is extremely important. And I hope that you'll see over the course of the talk that each project, that each example that I show you actually has to do with engagement. Engagement of patients and members of the public, engagement of policymakers and citizens, engagement of communities more broadly. And I should mention before leaving this slide as well is that Catherine Boydell, she's just recently moved to the University of New South Wales in Australia, but she is the leader of an arts-based qualitative research collaborative that is actually national in scope, and I was one of the founding members of that. And so we actually have quite a network, a small network of people across the country who are engaged in similar kinds of pursuits, just so you know. And we are producing a range of products, but also starting to develop quite a growth in terms of publications, scholarly publications on this, developing theory and methodology. So there's growing recognition that arts-based methods illuminate human dimensions of health and illness, but they also foster interdisciplinary collaboration. So I work with photographers, filmmakers, healthcare practitioners, health economists, and so forth. They also enhance our understanding of health and social care. I think one of the things that's really interesting is the way it evokes, for example, knowledge translation products, evoke emotional responses in viewers and how that may make the messages that we have stickier. So just to give you an example, I had a CHR-funded project, an operating grant that was called Picturing Foster Care, used photo voice methodology, and it culminated in a large-scale photography exhibit of over 80 photos and stories from the perspectives of young mothers and fathers living in poverty, child welfare workers, and perinatal healthcare professionals. And we were looking at the issue of perinatal child custody loss. And so you can imagine that the intersection of health and social care, all of those participants from those different groups produced pictures that we put together. And then we worked with a professional photographer as well as somebody who's used to installing installations with the AGO, and we thematically analyzed, but put all together in a very artistic way. And it was interesting because my colleague Jonathan McGuire came down and he said, I'm a quantitative researcher, and he was walking around with me through the exhibit, and he said, this is so interesting. He said, I spend all my time trying to take emotion out of all the stuff that I do because I'm doing quantitative, because I see it as a confounder. But here you put that emotion back in, and I love it. I love the fact that it's beautiful and that it makes me feel emotional. And one of the talks I have, I can always come back to talk to you. It's about impact specifically that I recently presented, and one of the things I called it, I used to think that if it made people cry, that was a bad thing, but it isn't necessarily. So that role of emotion, I don't think we should undersell. And I will show you an example of something that is quite emotional in one of the film trailers I'm going to show today. The other thing about arts-based, the arts, is that they offer alternative forms of representation. So not only representation of data, but representation of people's perspectives, representation of particular groups, and they challenge our assumptions in that way. They also promote dialogue and sharing of stories where meaning resides, and we're going to talk about meaning and narrative in just a minute. And they're also powerful, evocative, and from some of the work that we're starting to do, looking at evaluation and uptake, they are impactful. So now I'm going to go on and talk about methods and methodologies. And methodology, as you no doubt are aware, when we think methodology, that is the use of theory when we look at method as well. So it's a combination of the two. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about participatory, narrative, and visual approaches. So when we think about participatory approaches, you can have participatory approaches that are not arts-based. And sometimes when we think of participatory approaches, we think of one kind, which is a participatory action research, which you will read papers on, and there's a very particular way, usually, that participatory action research is conducted. I'm talking about participatory approaches more broadly, and that's why I put a continuum along here, from no participation to all the way of participation in many or all aspects. It's not unique to arts-based research, but many arts-based approaches in health research are participatory, and you'd be hard-pressed to find projects where participants in these kinds of projects are not engaged in some way in the creative process or having some say in how their data are used or represented. In terms of the continuum of participation, while it appears linear for simplicity's sake, I would say it should be considered to take on a variety of different forms. So the no participation is pretty straightforward, but in the middle area, it could be that participants or members of a community of interest in the research, with respect to the research topic, act in an advisory capacity, but don't participate directly in the research. So you can have sort of participant advisory boards or community advisory boards that are part of your research project. Alternatively, you could have participants who assist in the development of interview guides, for example, who actually help with the design of the research itself, and that's based on their unique and in-depth understanding of the topic. In other models, the participants themselves may even participate in the co-creation and co-collection of data, or they may also assist with data analysis in some way. And in more fully participatory models, the participants may be involved in knowledge translation and dissemination of the results, presenting at conferences alongside academic researchers, contributing to papers, and so forth. And I'm going to show you an example of that momentarily. So what kind of models you choose partly depend on weighing both the benefits, i.e. the unique expertise shared by participants who have an intimate knowledge, insider knowledge of the issue under study, versus the challenges, which can range from the time it takes to engage in such research, all the way up to the ethical considerations of having insiders collecting data amongst their peers. So arts-based approaches are closely linked to those of narrative and storytelling. And this is intricately wound up with many of the genres included under the label arts-based research. So if you think about filmmaking, photo voice, poetry-informed research, research-based drama, dance, visual diaries, digital storytelling, all of these are grounded in narrative. And this is a photograph of one of Catherine's pieces. So she actually has used dance as a knowledge translation tool with her study where she she worked with a professional choreographer to create a dance piece that was based on a series of in-depth interviews she did with young people as they told their stories of coming to diagnosis with first episode psychosis. And she used this as a knowledge translation tool, both presenting to healthcare professionals as well as in high schools, for example, because this is about young people in that age group. And so promoting dialogue and then having a question and answer session after presenting this. And she's published this work as well. So narrative approaches. Why stories? Well, human beings, we're storytelling animals. From the time we're born until the moment we take our last breath, we're surrounded by stories. And stories about us extend before and after our own lives. Stories are everywhere, as common as air, as Garrow and Mattingly attest. As such, they may appear on the surface to be simple, and yet they're extraordinarily complex, nuanced, instructive, and fulfill multiple functions. Stories are not only descriptive, they tell us what happened, but also what ought to happen, and they're replete with moral messages. Why would we care about stories in healthcare? Well, I think clinical practice itself is a storied experience. It's an experience whereby clinicians and patients mutually adopt the roles of both tellers and listeners. Stories not only reflect experiences, but they also shape human conduct, offering concrete simulations for future situations. In clinical education, we routinely use stories as teaching tools. So we've talked about stories in terms of why they're important for clinical practice, why they might be important to us generally, but why are they important for research? Well, when I talk about narrative methodology, these are rooted in the tradition of interpretive qualitative social science. And when we say narrative, it's how we assign meanings to experiences and how we make sense of them. Narrative, or storytelling, is how we come to know one another, and particularly when we think about dialogue, where we're sharing perspectives and stories. And I mentioned already the descriptive and prescriptive function of stories, and that we're interested not only in the content of what is said, but also how it is said. Why do people tell it that way? Well, why would this matter for research or research in the healthcare sector? Well, I and Jim Lavery would argue that stories are a form of evidence, but a different kind of evidence. Unlike quantitative data and its analysis, stories do not produce generalizable evidence, but rather they constitute particularized evidence. Qualitative research attempts to context, and we ignore context at our peril. In healthcare, people become ill and recover in context, embedded in a web of relationships, attitudes, and social forces. And this is what it means to do naturalistic or qualitative inquiry. But I'm also a visual researcher. So I'm going to say a little bit about my interest in visual as well as narrative approaches, and I think they go together really, really well. Let's talk a little bit about what we can learn by incorporating images and stories as data. As someone grounded in the interpretivist tradition of qualitative inquiry, I'm interested in both how stories and images, whether still or moving, are open to a multiplicity of interpretations, and the ways in which the viewer brings their own understanding to the material presented. So I love this particular image, which was taken actually by my husband, who's a healthcare professional, on his way home from a night shift at the hospital. And because it seems to me to potentially convey a story, to raise questions by juxtaposing the word on the jacket with the commonplace setting of the scene. And it speaks to me about the covert nature of violence in the city of Toronto, which erupts to the surface at intervals, but can happen in very benign seeming environments. Having spent time in my postdoctoral work studying neighborhoods and health, the notion of story and disorder, function and dysfunction are encapsulated for me in this image. And yet that's my interpretation, and you may have quite a different interpretation of it. For me, the comfortably familiar and the unfamiliar and unsettling are combined and make me question whether what I see is always as it seems. So just a very brief word about the theoretical underpinnings around visual research, and I apologize that this is very brief, but just one slide on this. But one of the reasons images are important is about representation. Representations matter. They shape the experiences of those who are represented or misrepresented. Images, whether on film or as still photographs, are powerful ways of representing experience. and they're tools for the discovery of self and other. They can also, because they're familiar, can act as a leveling device. And as I've already mentioned, not only do they have cognitive features, but they also have affective aspects. And they offer opportunities for critical reflection, as well as for engaging people in a different way. And I think there's a participatory stance inherent to a lot of the work that I do, certainly, but I think to a lot of people who use film and photo voice. And one of the things we do in pretty much all the film-based work that I'm going to show you involves the participants editing and choosing how to represent their own story. So now, without further ado, I'm going to move on to some examples. So all of these examples are based on in-depth narrative interviewing with study participants. That's what this picture is about. And most of them are filmed. And almost everyone goes through 2 or more interviews in the projects that I'm going to present to you. So the first project I'm going to discuss with you is a documentary film called What's Art Got to Do with It? This is originally a CIHR-funded project. We later got funding from the Toronto Arts Council and from Bell Let's Talk to finish the film. But we got a small knowledge dissemination grant from CIHR to get started with this project. And it's about the Creative Work Studio, which is an arts-based occupational therapy program at St. Michael's Hospital in the Inner City Health Program. And it's engaged also in vocational rehabilitation for adults recovering from mental illness. And the goal of our research project at the outset was that Isabel, who's been running the program now for about 16 years, at the time it was about 12 years, I think, that she had been asked to present about this very unique program, and she'd had a lot of success with it, and she wanted to start to present key learnings from the program in a way that she could disseminate more broadly. So she wanted to share about the program's benefits and unique contributions. She wanted participants to engage in sharing their experiences in the studio and the role of the studio in the recovery process. And I'm going to show you a trailer.
Welcome. This place is a really, really safe place here, a place where I feel understood.
These are some of the members of the Creative Work Studio. It's an occupational therapy program and an artist sanctuary. Everyone here knows the pain and anxiety that comes from having a major mental illness or addiction. Many of the people who come to the studio have never done art before. They soon become artists when they become part of the studio community. Above the studio are 25 units of supportive housing provided by our partner, the Good Shepherd Nonprofit Homes.
I'm curious, how did the studio come about?
I started about 12 years ago, and it was in the mid to late 90s, and a lot of things were getting cut. As an occupational therapist, but also as an artist, I really believed in how powerful activity and creative activity can be.
Because of my addictions, I lost 25 years as an artist, and now I'm trying to catch up. I wasn't in a very good place. Homeless and addiction and depression and like even suicidal come up for that matter.
Do you think the creative process affects your health in any way?
Even the worst day on this wall was a better day than I usually have. I can't see what life would be without doing something in this venue.
So he has a 15 chapel to work on.
Yeah, sign me up.
But I have had schizoaffective disorder since I was in my teens. It was never treated. It was never even recognized, let alone treated. And so I went through life from one train wreck to the next. And it got to the point where I just said, that's it. You know what? I had enough. I raised my kids. I wasn't able to work anymore because I was so sick. And I didn't have anything in my life. I remember sharing with you my plan. And my plan was that I was going to kill myself in October. I had, in one of my manic periods, bought a really nice camera, and which I never used, of course. And I took it to Hyde Park, and I took some pictures of flowers because I love color, ironically. And when I came home and put them up on the computer, I was just amazed at what I saw, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's potential here. But until I brought them in here and people said to me, these flowers are beautiful, I never thought that I really had any kind of talent artistically whatsoever. And it was at that moment that I started to feel that maybe I was a part of the studio, and that maybe I was an equal member among members of the studio. You know, when I came here, I was finished. I was done. And now look at me, I don't want to die.
So that's one example, and I'm going to go on and talk to you about the research component. So that's a 5-minute trailer of a 50-minute documentary. So it's a full-length documentary. We've shown it. It was actually an official selection at the Female Eye Film Festival in 2013. It's played to a sold-out audience at the Carlton Cinema, sold-out audience at Tiff Bell Lightbox. We sold it to CBC and had 2 national broadcasts on their documentary channel. So we were, we started with $14,000. We didn't expect that to happen from this. But I think, in terms of knowledge translation and sharing of stories, and I'm going to tell you about the participatory aspect of it in just a minute, but how intensely participatory it was with the people that you saw and how generous they were. But we worked with occupational therapy students and research coordinators and myself, and we conducted a series of interviews with 10 participants over the course of a year and a half. It was a long, prolonged engagement over time where they were involved very intimately in the process, and we got to know them very well, and we conducted a series of interviews with them. And what emerged from those interviews and from the analysis, particularly with one of the students' projects, was about the importance of transforming occupational identity through a creative environment, and what the role of the studio was for participants in this particular kind of health intervention. And all of the participants talked about a journey from patient to artist throughout. And that's a sort of a common theme throughout. But then there were 7 sub-themes that underlay that. And those had to do with the importance of building relationships in the context of the studio. Most people had been incredibly isolated beforehand. The notion of being seen and heard, that was incredibly important, that this was one of the few places in the city where they could go and actually express themselves because they didn't feel it was possible to express themselves in other venues. It was a place to go and actually create art and actually have the materials supplied, because most people are in this program aren't able to work and are on long-term disability, and many of them require social support. The notion of being productive and the importance of occupation, meaningful occupation, and the notion of a culture of acceptance was extremely important. They also talk about the freedom and opportunities to learn, as well as economic opportunities, because they're actually able to sell their work through the studio. And this is very meaningful to them to feel that they're valuable contributing members in that way. Well, what makes it participatory? Well, where do I start? So, one of the things that makes it, there are many things that make it participatory. So when we started this project, we actually worked with the members of the studio, the participants in the program, to help us design it and to put together our REB applications. They actually helped us design the interview guides in a sensitive and way that they felt would be respectful. They engaged in doing some of the camera work themselves. They produced all the artwork in the film. They wrote the music for the film. They were, as I say, deeply and intimately engaged with all aspects of this process. They were involved in the editing process. They had final say over what got shown and what didn't get shown in the film. And so it was an ongoing iterative process, very labor intensive, but very much well worth doing. This is a photograph taken at our TIFF Bell Lightbox screening, and those are some of our participants, and they actually co-present alongside with us usually when we present this work, particularly when we show the full-length film, and they participate in Q&As. And now they are going on, for example, the woman in the film who's the photographer has now gone on to become a documentary filmmaker herself. She's taken courses in documentary filmmaking, and she's continuing to tell her own story, and she's just gotten a grant for a full-length documentary, which she's working on currently. So, enough of that. Now we're going to talk about something completely different. So another film-based method that I'm involved with is the one that I developed with my colleague Jim Lowry. And we've been spending the last 6 or so years developing this. And this is a snapshot of a paper that actually describes the method. It's a film-based qualitative research method for studying complex health and social issues. And it's based on dialogic narrative theory. We're particularly interested in dialogue because we think there's something about dialogue and interaction of perspectives that can actually be a really great opportunity for learning and understanding problems in new ways. It's a participatory research process which uses filmed in-depth interviews with participants. Again, participants have full control over what gets shown at each part of the process and what they are willing to share with others. And a range of relative perspectives is sought. And it brings in, one of the things we think is a benefit of it is it brings in voices not generally included in deliberations and policy discussions. We've actually used this in a couple of health technology assessment contexts. So I'm going to rather than me droning on about the method, we decided that we'd make an animation to describe the method in 3 minutes. So broker dialogue in 3 minutes.
Controversial issues arise every day. These issues involve many different people, each with their own interests and perspectives. Sometimes the controversies arise or are perpetuated because the various parties involved don't talk to one another. In fact, there are lots of reasons why people don't talk to one another. And as if that isn't bad enough, when people don't talk to one another, it just makes things worse. But what would happen if some of these obstacles could be overcome? What if we could help to bridge some of these gaps in communication? What if there was a way to bring people together, to help them engage and let them confront each other, but in a safe and respectful and honest way, to genuinely share perspectives and learn about each other's interests through dialogue? And then what if you could share that dialogue with other people facing the same issues so that they could benefit from the experience as well? We've created a method that does all of this. We call it broker dialogue. Here's how it works. We start the dialogue about a given issue by identifying someone with legitimate interest in the issue and interviewing them on film to get their perspective. We find out a bit about them, about why the issue is important to them, and about their specific views on the issue. We then ask them a key question. Is there anyone that you would like to have a dialogue with about this issue? There always is. Broker dialogue gives the participants ultimate control over what other people in the dialogue will see from their interviews. So after reviewing their own video footage, and after they have identified clips that they want to share with others, we take their footage to the person they wanted to engage in dialogue. Now imagine how the dialogue can expand as participants start to pose questions to other people and make comments and responses to the videos they are shown. And imagine how we can build up a record of these exchanges using video editing, making sure that all the participants have a fair opportunity to be heard and have their perspectives taken seriously. We know that participating in honest dialogue can change people's views about controversial issues. It may be one of the only things that actually can. But what we're trying to learn is whether creating dialogue in situations where people are not talking or engaging respectfully and constructively with one another can have an impact beyond the participants in the dialogue themselves. So the final step in the broker dialogue method involves using the resulting films, or maybe even animations like this one, or stage plays, or other types of creative applications, to share the dialogue with other interested parties to try to encourage dialogue and constructive engagement about the issue more broadly in society. The possibilities are endless. Broker dialogue, building understanding where it's needed the most.
So that gives you a brief introduction to broker dialogue. And I thought I'd tell you a few projects that we've been working on. I'm going to show you a trailer from another project that was actually with the Ontario Citizens Council on drug system reform, because I thought that would be of interest to you. We got our start actually with THETA. They actually gave us money to do our pilot. So to look at a controversial drug funding decision with CDAC around the decision at that time not to fund insulin glargine. And so we actually were able to, they said, we'd like you to try to do something with this and try out your method and see how it works. And we got an opportunity to do that, and that was the first project that we finished. The second project that we did was with the Ontario Citizens Council on drug system reform with the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care for the Ontario Public Drugs Program. And then, so we completed those two, and now we're just wrapping up a project with Choosing Wisely Canada with Wendy Levinson, and on the topic of overutilization in the healthcare system, and we bring together perspectives of patients, physicians, and policymakers in that broker dialogue. We have funding and have two projects underway. THETA and I are involved in a project for the Toronto Academic Health Sciences Network, evaluating the vaccinator mask policy amongst frontline healthcare workers in terms of influenza vaccination. And we are doing both standard qualitative methods, quantitative methods, economic modeling, and we're also had proposed, and it was accepted, to do a broker dialogue as a knowledge translation strategy at the end, which I think will be really, really interesting. So that is funded, and we are moving forward with that project, so stay tuned. And then we also recently received funding. I'm working with Andrea Bani, who's a endocrinologist, and we're going to be looking at transitions in care experienced by young adults with type 1 diabetes, particularly around the issue that's difficult for clinicians because when young patients come in the transition from pediatric to adult care, and what is the role of the parent, and wherein do the obligations lie? And it's actually some kind of difficult for physicians in that way. And so we've got funding, and we're actually going to do an animated broker dialogue for that. Well, I wanted to talk to you about the Ontario Citizens Council project, and then I'm going to just wrap up. I think we'll leave the one about mosquitoes, films on mosquitoes out. But we'll talk about the Ontario Citizens Council. And so we were asked to conduct an evaluation of the Citizens Council over its first 2 years of its existence. So just for those of you who aren't familiar, the Ontario Citizens Council is an advisory body of the executive officer of the ODP, and its role is to, at its inception was to provide advice on the values that reflect the needs, culture, and attitudes of Ontario citizens about government drug policy. So it started in 2010 that the first meeting of the Citizens Council was conducted, and then we followed it over the course of those 2 years. And when we call it Great Expectations because one of the key findings was that while in many ways it's a very innovative and interesting way to bring the members of the public into the decision-making arena, the expectations when you invite members of the public in, and the expectations on the part of the government and the expectations of members of the council were quite different. And we did find a divide between them, sort of saying, well, that's not what we intended, right? And yet there were incredibly positive things about having members of the public there, and sort of what the expectations were. That's what the evaluation revealed. But because this is being taped, I decided, we're still waiting for permissions in terms of the actual evaluative film, but the government actually used some of our footage from the broker dialogue, asked to use some of our footage to actually design a recruitment trailer for future Citizens Council members, and it tells you a little bit about the council, but it doesn't show you that back and forth, unfortunately, but I can show that to you at another time. This is off the is on the government website.
This kind of citizen action, citizen involvement, citizen engagement really lends itself to getting just the average guy like me, providing an opportunity to talk and be listened to and presumably, hopefully, have some action taken.
What excited me was the fact that my opinion was heard. The Citizens Council came out of a series of drug reforms that the province made over the past several years. So we wanted to include, as part of the drug decision-making process, a greater voice for patients and the public to inform our decision-making. The Citizens Council is more of a discussion about larger systemic issues, and where we're trying to grapple with what direction do we want to take certain aspects of the program. And that's not necessarily about just the patients. That's about all of us as Ontarians.
Very often, the Ontario Drugs Program is on the front page of the newspapers. They have to make some very, very difficult decisions. And I think that the intention is that with the Citizens Council contemplating on these issues, they will have a greater depth of understanding of the issues.
You don't have to be Albert Einstein to have an important opinion. Like, the average Joe has some really important things to say, and sometimes some really profound things to say. You just gotta listen to them. I hope that I extended myself and pushed myself to see others' views and to make as much of a positive contribution to the Ministry of Health and, you know, the drugs and the $1.9 billion budget that we're actually helping more people. We're in a better spot at the end of my term than at the beginning of the term. So that's my ultimate goal.
So, in terms of the what we found, I mentioned that one of the major things was this difference in terms of expectations, and that overall we felt that the Ontario Citizens Council was very much a success in the making. It was very innovative and very brave of the government to ask people to come in and actually tell them what they thought was really important, and they worked really hard. They would spend an entire weekend, you know, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, engaged on a particular topic that they'd been asked to engage with, and they were passionate about this, and so that was something that was surprising, I think, both to the council members themselves about how engaged they got in the process, and it was also surprising for the government about how engaged they were. And it was very positive from that perspective. It showed a lot of vision, I think, on the part of the OPDP, but nevertheless, some important concerns were identified. And part of that had to do with the fact that the mandate of the Ontario Citizen Council, when it was a new thing here in Canada, it was first of its kind in Canada, relatively new, so it was a reasonably vague mandate to start. So we suggested that probably clarifying that would be really helpful. And that participants, another thing that was important is that when participants are activated to participate, they saw it as an important opportunity to actually speak directly to government. And that's a very powerful thing, and that's something that needs to be really attended to and acknowledged. And if their contributions aren't recognized or acknowledged, that can lead to disappointment and disillusionment. People were concerned that they wanted to know not just that their input was appreciated, but they also wanted to have some kind of understanding of how it was actually going to be used and how it was actually going to make a difference. So I think what I will do is I'm going to stop there because I want to leave time. We've also done a project called Eliminate Dengue with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is a retrospective video case study, but we're running out of time, and I did want to leave a bit of time for a discussion. So I think I'll just skip for the last bit, and then hopefully we have a bit of time to chat.
Thanks so much, Dept, for that fantastic talk. I think we all enjoyed it. It's quite new for us.
It's different, I know.
Completely different. Okay, so question first.
Thank you very much. That was great. But because I personally come from a quantitative background, I'm trying to understand you think the power of the art component is on the extraction of the information from the participant, or the dissemination, or the understanding of the researcher, or the dissemination? Where do you think that the strength of using the art is in the...
That's a really great question. So the question is about where the strength of using the arts is. Is it about sort of disseminating, and is it what the researcher extracts from the data?
Yeah, does it help you understand better what the participant is transferring to you, or is it that or the participant is expressing him or herself easier through
the art? I think that it's both, actually. So that it's participants actually really like the opportunity to tell the story in their own words, or to express it in their own words. So, for example, if they're using drawing, or if they're using photography, which we didn't talk about when photo boys, they actually create the photographs themselves. They also like being part of that editing process when we do the films, that they like being part of that editing process. But they also say, when we ask them about it, that for them, they say that that ability to interact with other people's perspectives deepens their understanding of it, and that it actually influences sort of how they start to think about the issue. And so they talk about, so with narrative, when we talk about storytelling, usually each time a person tells a story, the teller and the listener are both changed in it. So it's a bit like hitting a moving target. But the other power of the art is that I think the fact that it's the participants who are telling it, so there's an authenticity to it, for example, when people are telling it. But I also think that there's something about the aesthetics as well, as when it's put together in a way with artists and researchers together. So you've done some rigorous analysis, plus you've worked closely with artists to produce something that is more powerful than if you just put out raw footage, for example. Without sort of any attention to music or timing or pacing or any of that kind of thing. I don't think it would be as powerful if you didn't have that artistic lens on it. So I think there is something about the artistic and aesthetic experience that is really important as well. So I think it's a dual thing. It's about participating and creating, and sometimes, like as I said in Photo Voice, the participants are actually creating themselves, right?
I want to follow up on that theme there. You talked a lot about knowledge translation, but in fact, what you're creating is data.
Yes.
You're not really translating. You're not technically translating this bit of information to that person.
That's true.
And just like statistical data is better received if you use good presentation of the data, more understandable. So my question really is, there's a big push to create knowledge translation. Professionals engage in knowledge translation, but what you're doing really is just generating data. And that's the art, something that can be interpreted over and over again. So how can we, from obviously successful in this, could you be equally successful if you said that you're not engaged in knowledge translation? You're just problematizing and you're just presenting something that can be interpreted multiple ways.
I agree with you, and I apologize because some of these slides and some of my talk has been taken from some of my work on knowledge translation when I've given knowledge translation talks, so I do apologize for that. But yes, no, I do very much see the work that we do in all of these projects. It is primary knowledge production. It's data collection, and we do our usual qualitative analysis on it, in depth. And a lot of it never makes it into the knowledge translation package that we have. I completely agree with you, and I think that is one of our roles, is to problematize, is to challenge our assumptions, is to understand phenomena in a very fundamental way. And then the nice thing, it's almost like a value add, I think, because if you think of film, like it generates, or photography, visual and storytelling, interviews, observations, they create so much rich data that you can use that it's really sort of a godsend as a social science researcher, I think.
Just one follow-up on, given part of qualitative data and one of the powerful bit of it, also the limitation is that the investigators are the filters.
Mm-hmm.
They sort, they select.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine any way of creating using your results and just depositing it, making it accessible?
Oh, that's a really good question. And actually, we're involved in, actually, I've got a master's student who's looking at this, because it's still, in terms of healthcare, arts-based methods are still relatively new in terms of the whole ethics piece of it. At the moment, we're not sort of allowed to sort of, at this point, sort of set that raw data out there for analysis. All qualitative researchers do secondary analysis on data. You have to get an REB approval to do that. But the idea of having a repository, we're trying to figure out how to do that. Oh, wonderful. I would love to hear that, because that's something that we as qualitative researchers are struggling with, is in terms of repository and identifiable data. Because you can imagine, somebody telling their story and they're completely fine. They've given their permission to be identified, but the REB gets very anxious about that kind of thing.
Thanks for great speaking. I was wondering how you decide the medium when you're capturing art space. So how do you decide between doing like the cartoon-based film versus drama versus someone reflecting on their own story through video? And how do you go about that?
That's a really good question. Often with broker dialogue, for example, we're interested in specifically where dialogue is either controversial or contested, or it's not happening, or there's important silences that we're trying to sort of understand, or there seem to be gaps in our understanding. So that's usually sort of this gap area that we sort of try to bring the broker dialogue to, because we think it's particularly good at addressing that. But for other things, such as documentary film, sometimes it's being able to share stories in a broadly accessible format. For example, if it is a knowledge translation, or as I say, like if there's something that's going to be important to capture visually, so for example, observational types of research, that kind of thing. It's a good question, though, because I mean, with Photo Voice, for example, the Photo Voice project I did, I chose purposefully not to use film, and we had the participants do photographs, but the first thing they had to do was, the first exercise we gave them was to take a self-portrait without showing their face, because it was about child custody loss, and there are legal requirements, and it's very stigmatizing. And there are also legal requirements on the parents not to identify themselves because their children could be identified. So we had to work, that was my reason for moving to photography, so that people could actually create photographs that were non-identifiable, but that were representational of their experiences. So that was extremely important. So that was my rationale for going photo voices instead of film. That can sometimes be the reason for going for animation. That was why Andrew and I talked about doing an animated broker dialogue for the type 1 diabetes study, because we feel that if parents and children want to really share their stories in an interesting way, they may want to be anonymized, but a great way to capture that in the moment kind of thing is to actually animate it.
Any other questions? Yes, I think then we can all wrap up. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
And additionally,